It's wonderful to hear all that bonhomie and camaraderie and any other French words of that nature happening. It was great to watch everyone interacting over lunch. It's just great to be back face to face, isn't it? So welcome back for the afternoon session, which is going to be action-packed. We have a lot of people to be talking to you, including, of course, our Minister and the Chair of our State Planning Commission and noted guests from interstate, the likes of your hometown hero, Stuart Mosley, who's doing something on his phone. So welcome back, everyone. But before we get into that, could I just ask Anthony, I've lost the last Kelly, from our major platinum sponsors, Molla Olsen, to just say a few words. Thank you so much for your sponsorship, Anthony. We're very happy to have you along.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. There's nothing that drags a crowd back into a room after a lunch like listening to a lawyer come and speak for a little bit. So I'm going to talk about change in the planning system. As everyone knows, the theme for this year's conference is change. It's often said that change is the only constant in life. It's an expression that dates back to Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher in around 500 BC, so it's not a new concept. Tied into his theory of change was his belief that a change in one direction is ultimately balanced by a corresponding change in another direction. The last few years have seen drastic changes, some of which none of us could possibly have imagined. The most obvious and significant change has been COVID. If you'd asked most of us about something like a global pandemic occurring 4 or 5 years ago, it wouldn't have even registered as being something that was either possible or likely, unless perhaps you were Bill Gates. But here we are, and I think most people would say we have come through it remarkably well. In a town planning context, there have also been significant changes to the town planning system over the last few years and since the implementation of the Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act. In the case of the PDI Act, a question being asked by many is whether a change in one direction has been balanced by a corresponding change in another direction. This is not a new issue and is a constant dilemma with any changes to the planning system. The planning system, as we all know, has to deal with a wide range of matters and often feels like a large elephant in the photo trying to balance on a small ball. In particular, the question always being asked is whether we've got the balance right in the system. Things like efficiencies, quicker approval times and lack of red tape on the one hand, against matters like thoroughness, robustness and the rights of the community on the other. Is it about economic imperatives or good planning outcomes? Are those issues even mutually exclusive? There are a whole range of issues which have to be considered in order to balance out the system. The first issue I'm going to touch on briefly relates to the impact of COVID and what long-term effects this has had. Thankfully, in South Australia, the impacts have not been as significant as in other places, but there have still been a notable shift in the number of people working from home as opposed to coming into the office, whether that is for a couple of days a week or on a more full-time basis. Now, this is the working from home that we all think it is, and in reality, for a lot of us, this is the reality of it, where you're getting dragged, pushed and pulled in a million different directions and it's not quite what we all thought it was going to be. But the working from home has the potential to have an impact on both how the CBD and the suburbs work. All of a sudden there are more people working from home. These people are utilising local businesses more, whether that is coffee shops, food outlets, fitness centres or a range of other businesses. Not to mention using a lot more electricity, with homes and offices both having the lights on. How does the planning system respond to this changing dynamic? Similarly, in the CBD, it's necessary to consider what shifts to the system are required to get people back into the city, whether that's going out to restaurants, bars and the like, through to people working in offices more rather than working from home. These are ancillary issues which will need to be addressed as well. There's other issues such as whether more people are driving to work to avoid catching public transport and the potential health risks that people see that posing, and the flow-on impact that that has on things like parking availability and congestion in the surrounding street networks. All of these issues will need to be grappled with as part of the planning system and the longer-term planning vision for the state. Another issue which is a constant change and which will also need to be considered as part of the longer-term planning vision for the state is a changing population profile of South Australia and what influence the changing demographics of South Australia has as part of the planning system. Clearly, as the population grows, there will be a need to plan out where these people live and work and what our neighbourhoods look like. More significantly, though, is how the changing demographics will influence and shape the system itself. At the risk of putting everyone to sleep with some statistics, they are helpful at giving context to some of the issues that South Australia is facing. So based on a range of sources, some of the relevant demographic information for South Australia includes that as at June last year, the population was almost 1.8 million people, which was an increase of only 2,966 people over the year before, with an overall net migration loss of 2,600 people. The government predicts that by 2041 the population will increase by approximately 130 to 440,000 people. That's based on a low and high case scenario, taking into account things like future fertility, mortality and migration. There's also been an increase in the 45 to 65 age bracket and the over 65 age bracket as a percentage of the population between 1991 and 2021, with it growing from 33% to 45%. And since the mid-80s, there's been a significant reduction in the number of people employed in manufacturing, with this decreasing from around 100,000 people being employed to around 65,000 people being employed in manufacturing, which has been offset by a significant increase in health and professional workers. This highlights some of the issues the planning system will need to grapple with. Firstly, how to respond to a population which is increasing, but as a percentage is growing older, and secondly, an employment profile which is shifting from a manufacturing base to a greater number of workers being in the health system and professional workers. As part of this, someone will also need to pull out their crystal ball to try and work out what longer-term impacts COVID might have on the employment profile. Prior to COVID, as a country, we had an increasing reliance on importing many of the goods we needed. COVID has caused a lot of supply chain issues and created problems for most, if not all, industries. The question which arises from this is whether there is likely to be a shift to more onshore manufacturing, and if so, where that's accommodated within the state and how does the planning system address it? And is this considered in the context of climate change as well and the distance it takes for us to receive our goods? Then come to the planning system itself. And in order to look to the future, it's often necessary to go back to the past. In this case, the planning system over the years. Importantly, what has changed in the system over this time and what have been the drivers for this. In what seems like a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, South Australia's planning system goes back to at least the 1920s, albeit the system in a form akin to what we see today was first implemented in the late 1960s by the Planning and Development Act 1966 to 67. The Planning and Development Act established a state planning authority as well as a planning appeals board to hear appeals against decisions of the relevant authority assessing a development application. Interestingly, any person aggrieved by a decision could appeal to the Planning Appeal Board, so it wasn't as limited as what we've got today. The Act also saw the introduction of planning areas and the adoption of development plans, which were seen as a tool to guide the future development of the state. We then come to the Planning Act 1982, and under the Planning Act, a purpose behind the Act was introduced for the first time. In this instance, the stated purpose of the Act was to provide for planning and to regulate development in the state. The Act established a planning appeal tribunal to deal with appeals in lieu of the Planning Appeal Board, and appeal rights were limited in respect of third-party appeals being rights specifically provided for in the regulations. We then come to what most people in the room are most familiar with, which is the Development Act. The Development Act in 1993 brought about some significant changes. For the first time within the Act itself, there was an object specifically enshrined into the legislation, and this stipulated that the object of the Act was to provide for proper, orderly and efficient planning and development in the state. Some of the other changes included the establishment of the ERD Court, rights for adjoining landowners to lodge representations in respect of a development application, and in some instances rights of appeal against decisions by virtue of the introduction of concepts of Category 1, 2 and 3 kinds of development. Development was also divided into different forms of development, namely complying, merit and non-complying. We then come to the current system. That also has an object in the Act, although it's in very different terms to the object of the 1993 Act in a lot more detail. The current Act sets out that the object is to support and enhance the state's livability and prosperity in ways that are ecologically sustainable and meet the needs and expectations and reflect the diversity of the state's communities by creating an effective, efficient, enabling planning system linked with other laws that, amongst things, promote and facilitate development and provide a scheme for community participation in relation to development of planning policies and strategies. Interestingly, there's no longer a reference to proper, orderly and efficient planning and development within the state, with it being replaced by a reference to an effective, efficient and enabling planning system. In addition, there are a number of other significant changes which most people would be familiar with, but those include things like a community engagement charter, which is an attempt to provide for greater public involvement in planning policy decisions, the implementation of the Planning and Design Code to replace development plans, the use of practice directions, provisions relating to the delivery and funding of infrastructure, new assessment categories to replace those in the Development Act, with associated changes to public notification requirements, to the ability of a person to make representations on a development application, and in relation to the ability of a person to appeal against a decision by the relevant authority. And there's also more concise timeframes around development and assessment. As with any new system, there will be pros and cons versus the system it's replaced. The system has gradually evolved over a number of decades and will continue to do so. Under the newest iteration of the system, on the face of it, the community has a greater say when it comes to the policies that are implemented in the code. But the question has to be asked whether those in the community have any interest in having a say at this stage, or will realise the consequences if they don't. This is balanced against what most would feel is a lessening of the ability for adjoining neighbours to have a say at the assessment stage, either in making a representation or having a right to appeal against a decision. For developers or those building, this might be a good thing, perhaps until they are the ones next door or undertaking a development in the locality and it's someone else utilising the system to their advantage. Then again, maybe that is what the community wants. But is this a good thing or a bad thing? Or is it not a matter of looking at it in terms of good or bad, right or wrong? The question that will need to be asked is whether the balance is right. Ultimately, time will tell, but we can all be sure of one thing: the system will continue to change in some way, shape or form in the future. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much. I'll just shake your hand. Thanks so much, and thanks for your sponsorship and ongoing support. And I notice you're an associate member too, so well done. Yeah. Okay. Moving right along, our next presentation is by Ellie Davidson, who is not with us in person today. In fact, it's a recorded presentation. But Ellie has been at the forefront of helping PIA to actually start to integrate Aboriginal culture and knowledge in everything we do. And so the concept of the Planning for Country Knowledge Circle is a PIA national initiative. Ellie I've got to know recently myself through various conferences and whatnot, but a really interesting history. She's a Balangara woman from the East Kimberley with family connections to Captain William Bligh. So she describes herself as caught in the crosswinds of Australia's story. She's a very engaging and passionate advocate for her the Indigenous knowledge and culture, but a qualified planner. She has her own business called Zion Planning, based in Mullumbimby in New South Wales. And I actually had a coffee with her on Wednesday, and I didn't realise she wasn't going to be here. But so if you could sort of, in her absence, if we can cue the music or the presentation, and we'll just hear from Ellie. So we'll welcome her even though she's not here. Give her a clap.
Jingili, my name is Ellie Davidson. I am a Balangara woman from the East Kimberley, and I'm recording this today on Bunjalung country. So I'm very fortunate to be able to pay respects to Arakwal people to the east, Midjumble people to the north, and Widjabul Wildbul people to the west. And I just want to pay my respects to custodians where you're dialing in from or sitting today on Kaurna country. I am really grateful to be able to share a little bit about starting with country, what it means to me, and some of the changes that I'm seeing in how planners approach working with country. So my background is as a town planner. I spent a lot of time in my early career working in development assessment and urban design, and then became a consultant and started working in social impact and engagement. And as I evolved in my profession and career and in my own cultural identity, I've been able to really focus in on what it means to be a planner and how to work with country, community and culture. So I have my own consulting and training company called Zion Engagement and Planning, and I'm also an Aboriginal planning lecturer with the University of Sydney. And what I suppose I'm really passionate about and what I'm seeing a lot of change in is how we as a profession, as planners, are considering this deep knowledge that exists of country and how that should inform better decision making. I'm really grateful to be on a journey with PIA, working with the Planning with Country Knowledge Circle. And a shout out particularly to David Williams and Audrey Marsh from PIA in helping us to come together as a group and really, I suppose, articulate what it means to be a planner and what it means to work with country. Just this week, I was down in Sydney and was fortunate enough to be working on a city centre master plan project, and we engaged a couple of custodians and knowledge holders, some online, some on country. When we were out on country, we actually I spotted a red-bellied black snake out in the bush in a location pretty close to the city centre. And I suppose when we were out there, we really identified that as a really important asset to the city moving forward, this idea of the city meets the bush and how those places could really be integrated into the master planning and future thinking of that place. But one of the things that really came through in that process was how water had been disconnected by the infrastructure and planning that occurred in that area. So right where a number of different creeks meet is also a major intersection of some of the main roads that move through this place, and also a train line that kind of comes through into that city area. And one of the interesting things that, as we yarned about the opportunities within this process to really recognise and explore country, we were talking a lot about water and the movement of water in that place and what that signified as well. So for us as Mob, this image here is actually of rivers. It's a topographic map that was commissioned, a piece of artwork that I had commissioned by the amazing Mel Ladkin. And what that actually shows is the importance of waterways on country, and generally water places were really good living places. They were resource rich and they were good places to camp out. We generally had seasonal camps, so we moved between different places. But water was obviously a really important resource on country, and a place where we would sit down, do business, also camp and gather. So you generally find that the water places are really important to Aboriginal people. And as you start to explore this idea of working with country, understanding the movement of water on country, where the high places are, and where water is, helps to give some indication of places that were of value. And interestingly, they're of value to us as well. So I think understanding the importance of those places and really trying to work that into your thinking when it comes to starting with country is really valuable. One of the aunties that I work with always requests creek lines and contours be mapped on anything that we worked together on. And what she does is she wants to understand where those high places are. Generally, the high places and ridge lines were really important pathways. They were movement corridors. They provided a really important vista and vantage point across different parts of country. And then where the water moved and where there was water was generally where people stopped and camped. So once you start to understand the context of these things, you can begin to really appreciate why it's important in our thinking to return these places and return that thinking to country. So in this process that I was involved in this week, it was really interesting to, I suppose, the design team had pulled together these maps that were like the green and the blue grid, you know, this kind of thinking that as planners and designers, we really tried to embed into our processes. But one of the things that really shifted in the way that we started to have dialogue around this was maybe we shouldn't be calling these, you know, a green and a blue grid, that maybe we should be calling them a connecting with country framework, or a way for us to understand and value the important parts of country. And one of the things that I shared in the context of this work was that, you know, I think that we need to shift that language and not just call it like a blue and a green grid, but we should really be thinking about how this can honour and reflect that actually we're just returning to country. We want to make sure that those links and those connections that have been broken through poor or ill-informed decision-making might be a process of us returning country and returning her values. One of the things that we talk about a lot is this idea of being able to walk country. What are people's experience, and how can they have these connected networks of places to move between? And one of the things that we are really starting to shift dialogue around is that's not just for people. As Aboriginal people, we see ourselves placed within a holistic system, within the Connecting with Country framework that we're working towards and helping to implement here in New South Wales. There's this triangle, right, where it's like the egocentric way of thinking and making decisions, where man is at the top and everything else scales down and is at a different point in that decision-making hierarchy. Whereas ecocentric or country-centered thinking is more like a circle. And we are at the same scale as all of the other parts of country. So, you know, trees and birds and other wildlife actually become just as important in our decision making. And as we start to think about this, and we start to think about these networks and ways to make sure that we have this really connected opportunity to move through country, that also provides opportunity for our kin, the flora and fauna, to have that opportunity to move through country as well. And so it's really interesting that as we start to reflect on the way that we are moving towards, I suppose, you know, people want to call it sustainability, they want to name and term these things and these concepts. I just want to encourage people to be thinking about this as a country-centred way of thinking. And for us to do that, we need to work really closely with custodians and knowledge holders to really understand those contexts of country and not run away. So out of this yarn, hearing about wet places or rivers or creeks being living places, we can't make assumptions that that's the same across all parts of country. So I wouldn't encourage anybody to go away and map that and start thinking about all water places being living places, because they weren't. But we need to work in partnership with our custodians and with our knowledge holders to really understand those stories and those values of country, and how that can help us to return our thinking to country, to have this country-centred way of making decisions and considering the future of these places. And I think that everybody wins. I feel as though if we do push forward and really consider starting with country and planning with country, then not only does the oldest living culture that exists here in Australia get brought to the surface, but we also have an opportunity to provide ways for everybody to connect with country and everybody to really value the opportunities that we have here to embed this way of thinking and this old knowledge into the work that we're doing. So I just encourage each of you to really reflect on who it is that you might be able to bring into these processes, ways that you can embed this type of knowledge into the decisions that you're making. And I'm looking forward to a future that is really built on a foundation of starting with country and honouring this knowledge that we all have the privilege of tapping into. So I hope that you enjoy the day together. I'm sorry that I can't be there, but looking forward to staying in touch. Boogle Bear, which means thank you.
And in her absence, I'd just like to acknowledge the work that Ellie and her team are doing to advance this, deeper understanding of how we can use Indigenous knowledge in what we do every day. We will move along quickly, and next up is we're lucky to have the chair of your State Planning Commission, Craig Holland, with us. And Craig, I won't do the bio. I think most people know who you are, but Craig's here just to give us an update on the activities and for the future for the Commission. Welcome.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah.
I acknowledge we meet on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I found that really interesting listening to Ellie, because we're all trying to work out how are we going to engage, and the Commission under Sally's leadership are looking at how can we meaningfully engage in the planning system, and so we're taking some careful steps forward, but I thought that was really interesting. Under the leadership of Michael Lennon, the previous Commission, which included Helen Dyer and Alan Holmes and Sally Smith and myself, we successfully delivered the new planning system on the 19th of March last year, and I can tell you it was quite some journey, and we're lucky that Sally's still with us. This was a very considerable achievement, and I wish to acknowledge the commitment and dedication of those members of the Commission, and more importantly, the hard-working team at Planning and Land Use Services. I got to know a lot of these young people, and some of them are still there. They survived the last 3 years, and some of them are working for you out there, and we couldn't have achieved it without their efforts. We would get emails late at night, weekends, so the hard-working team really got us there. We now have a new Commission charged with the responsibility of continuing the important planning and advisory and assessment functions required of us and specified in the Act. I was appointed to the Commission in November 2018 and recently reappointed in November 21, alongside 4 new Commission members who all bring outstanding planning credentials, and I'm pleased to say that we have some of them here today. Stuart Mosley, who's our keynote speaker, I've reconnected with after many years, and you know of Stuart's expertise in planning, urban management and executive leadership. Stuart has served as Chief Planner and Chief Executive of the Adelaide City Council, and I was around in those days when Stuart was there. Deputy Director General for the Queensland Government, and is currently the Chief Executive of the Victorian Planning Authority. And we are so fortunate that Stuart makes his valuable time available to us at the Commission. So my personal thanks to you, Stuart. And I look forward to his address this afternoon. on this subject of growth, which is the big subject for all of us. Eleanor Walker, who is with us today, whom I've met more recently, is a former South Australian president of your association and is a highly experienced planner with over 20 years in local government, and is a Victorian who so brings some of that expertise and experience to us. So welcome to you, Eleanor. Noelle Hurley is a legal practitioner who joined the bar in 2006 and through her various boards and other director positions brings an awareness of issues pertaining to governance, risk, strategies and responsibilities, all matters of significant responsibility and performance of the Commission. Our newest member is Stephen Griffiths, who brings qualifications in knowledge, experience in local government, public administration and the law, and Stephen has held various roles including Chief Executive of the North East Councils, Chief Executive Officer for the District of York Peninsula, and before being elected to the South Australian Parliament as the member for Goyder in 2006. Stephen brings some history to us in relation to he being the Shadow Minister, formerly under when Rao's legislation was coming through, and he brings some quite significant insights to us. And of course, Sally Smith, whom you all know, is well known to you all, and she has a distinguished career in planning, policy, assessment and strategy. As the Executive Director of Planning and Land Use Services, Sally has considerable responsibility advising the Commission and implementing our work, which is quite extensive, as well as all of her other roles and responsibilities in planning and land use services. In summary, the Commission members all bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to delivering the work of the Commission and all share a real common purpose in achieving the very best we can. And I'm so lucky that everybody on the Commission loves planning and loves the challenges that planning brings, which the new Minister is now embracing with great zeal. The Commission recently undertook a review of our strategic plan for 2022-23, which establishes our work priorities for the year ahead. Importantly, we've adopted 4 key strategies. Number 1, planning for growth and change, the subject of your day today. Number 2, enhancing our planning system. 3, leading on planning policy. And 4thly, discharging our statutory obligations. So change is the theme for today's conference, and coincidentally, it's a major priority for the Commission as well as we embark upon the implementation of the 7 regional plans for South Australia. The 6 country plans will commence this year with preliminary investigations already underway with Sally's team, followed by the 30-year plan which will take us through to next year and following into 2023, which is going to be an enormous and a challenge for us all. Commission members recently attended the Spencer Gulf Cities Regional Priorities Summit back in May, and where we had a workshop with the councils and the CEOs and planning staff and others from Whyalla, Port Pirie and Port Augusta, and we had a daily workshop. We had a day workshop in the morning, we had business and so on in the afternoon, community members, and we learned a great deal about the challenges that they have, but the exciting opportunities they have for growth as well. We also plan to now visit other regional areas across South Australia as we embark upon our plans. It's important that Commission members hear from the grassroots what people are saying, what the communities are saying, so that we can be fully embraced of the issues that our regional friends are and families are experiencing. This is all in accordance with our community engagement charter, which we undertake that role very seriously. Planning and growth is timely given the current issues, and we've heard those today around COVID and what it means for housing and where people live and how people work and where they will work. And for example, the impact on the renewable energy on Upper Spencer Gulf could be a huge game changer for the communities up there. And they've been struggling with no population growth and trying to have their community sustainable, which is really difficult to actually maintain. So these opportunities in Port Augusta, Whyalla and Port Pirie could be game changers, and we're excited about that. And whilst our regional communities are really keen to plan for growth and sustainable communities, some of our metropolitan councils are less concerned about growth and the impact that it's got on their communities, notwithstanding that we don't have as you've heard today, our population growth is quite limited, but amazingly so. We're still building 8,000 new houses a year. This past year, it's something like 14,000. So that's a huge amount of new housing, and there's more needed, as you all know. The implementation of the Environmental Food Production Boundary, the EFPA, and the Barossa Valley and McLaren Vale preservation districts intentionally constrained urban development from encroaching on agricultural and farming lands and our landscapes. So with that comes the other side of that coin is that it creates greater pressure on metropolitan Adelaide, how we live and how we'll provide for this growth. And so that's another challenge that we'll be looking forward to this year. As we've already looked at our land use supply last year. We're doing more work on land use supply and how land is taken up. Yesterday, the Commission members went to Gawler and spent the day talking to the Mayor, CEO and planning staff, and we visited Gawler East and all of their tensions they've got about planning for growth. We then visited Playford and we met with the same team there, and we went out to Riverlea and we went to Angle Vale, and we looked at the pressures that housing is having on infrastructure and how people move and live. And that's a great challenge because at Riverlea, for example, they've now sold 750 lots, which is 3 years ahead of where they thought they were going to be. They're planning for 500 lots a year. This is quite unbelievable growth when you're right out at the edge of the boundary of metropolitan Adelaide. And so that's going to create a challenge for public transport, for public utilities, for schools, hospitals and the like. So, for example, the nearest police stations in Elizabeth, the nearest ambulance centres in Elizabeth, and so all of these challenges, and we're going to hear about all of that in the next 12 months as we welcome our communities to providing information to us as we move around metropolitan Adelaide. We're going to visit again to Mount Barker, we're going to Port Adelaide and Enfield, we're going to Onkaparinga. Well, eventually the Commission members will go and visit every council in metropolitan Adelaide and in regionally so that we have first-hand knowledge of what's actually going on out there and how we can plan for it. The Commission is mindful of the challenges of the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide and particularly infrastructure. So what we learnt yesterday when we were driving around looking at Gawler and looking at Playford was the need for infrastructure to work with planned growth and where people are moving. So we're very cognizant of that, and in the work that we do in the next 18 months, we'll look at how we can integrate infrastructure with our thinking as we move forward. Climate change, urban tree canopy loss, increases in the heat island effect, car parking, traffic congestion, public transport, just some of the issues we face when we're planning for growth. And I know the ministers and I have discussed these matters, and he's very aware of all of these impacts that we're having on our communities, and we're aware of it too. So last year the Commission instigated an open space and trees project in recognition of the rising importance of dealing with temperature rises across Adelaide, the loss of tree canopies, and that urban infill is having, and the tree canopy attributed to infill is a significant issue that we're aware of. So we're currently working on a number of initiatives with the Department of Environment and Water and with Green Adelaide. And the first stage of this project involved looking at a review of trees that are exempt under legislation, looking at the issues of significant trees and regulated trees. We're looking at the exemptions, the sizes, the exemptions in relation to distances 10 metres from swimming pools and dwellings. All of these matters are going to be looked at and have been looked at, and then we'll be soon forwarding our advice to the Minister for his consideration. Further work is proposed to be undertaken on the part of our trees project, including a review of the infill tree policy and the tree canopies offset scheme, but this work will be considered pending the outcome of the Minister's implementation review on the planning system by the expert panel. In acknowledgement of the community concern expressed at the loss of tree canopy, gardens and the lack of street parking arising in the infill, we implemented significant policy changes. Those of you who may have taken note of our raising the bar on residential infill, we did a lot of work last year in this regard. For the first time in South Australia, we have planning legislation that is mandatory to plant trees, providing permeable landscape, like 15 to 25% of permeable soil for gardens, limiting driveway widths, limiting garage widths on allotments, and hence providing space for on-street parking and space for on-street council verges with trees and the like. So we saw a lot of examples when we were putting the code together and visiting the communities and so on, that under the old res code, and there were some very poor examples of 2-for-1s where it's basically a sea of paving, wide crossovers, nowhere for street trees, not a blade of grass in sight, high roof covers, coverage areas and so on. So we looked at that and thought, this is untenable, we can't continue in this manner. So our first project was looking at that. We're only just starting to see them becoming implemented now. There's 55 of them that are coming through the system. So this is a long-term plan. So we won't see the benefit of that for some years, but we'll be showing examples of these to you all very soon to show you what this means. And in effect, we viewed that infill as master planning in reverse, house block by house block by house block, so that in due course the suburban streets of Adelaide wouldn't just be a sea of double crossovers, no gardens, no trees. We took this really seriously, so that was a piece of the reform that Sally set aside a team to work on. Finally, I'd like to thank Chris Daniels and the team at Dew. We've put together this has taken nearly 18 months to have a tree planting guide, and that will be released next month, and that tree planting guide will show everybody how to plant trees, what sorts of trees, how to deal with their gardens for infill, so we can continue to work on the need for greening our suburbs. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak. I wish you well for the rest of the day, and in due course, you're going to hear from the Minister. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Craig, for that. You're probably used to this. It's an interesting model, the State Planning Commission model. It's not a common thing throughout Australia, so you've got an asset here which puts you ahead in many respects, I think. And I do love the last bit. I'm reminded of Rob Adams, who says, if you build great streets, you build a great city. So my next important and enjoyable duty is to introduce your new minister in this portfolio, the Honourable Nick Champion. Minister, I am going to read out your little bio because I think it's a cracker. So the minister... well, no, it's a beaut. Minister Champion is Minister for Planning, Housing and Urban Development, which is a really good suite to put together. So born in Elizabeth, South Australia, spent much of his working life advocating for workers' rights and representing his local community. So from the grassroots. First elected to federal parliament in 2007, served as Shadow Assistant Minister for Manufacturing and Science, along with Deputy Chair of Joint Standing Committee, Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, so interesting range. Mr Champion married the love of his life, Fiona, in, any guesses for where they got married? Gibraltar. Didn't see that coming, did you? No. And in 2016, years later, their family grew, and they're now raising their 5-year-old daughter, Louise, who I'm sure is much loved. Mr Champion resigned from federal parliament in 2022 to contest the seat of Taylor at the state election here, which is the community he now represents. Minister, we're delighted to welcome you here in your new capacity as Minister for Planning and to be with the professional colleagues in the planning profession. Welcome, Minister.
Thanks so much. I was a little worried then when I started talking about my bio, because President Kate and I have known each other for a very long time, actually, since I was first elected to federal parliament. So I was wondering what story might got told there, Greg. A little concerned. The reason we got married in Gibraltar is because if any of you are going to elope, being a federal MP, I had difficulties with the invite list to who to cut off, as it were. Knew many people. So Fiona and I eloped. You can get married in Copenhagen. It seems easy, but it's actually very hard. Italy, again, seems easy, very hard. But Gibraltar, you just fly in, stay one night, and away you go. So very informal beginning to my very formal speech. I would like to begin by acknowledging that this land we meet on today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with the country. Obviously, I like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. To Kate Hart, State President of the Planning Institute of Australia in this state. Thank you for your kind invitation to speak today and share my observations of the first 85 days of a new government. I should get a calendar clicking over in my office. I keep asking my Chief of Staff, James, so how many days is it again? And I'd really like to thank all of those who have assisted in my steep learning curve. Craig Holden, who's put up with a lot of questions from me. Sally Smith, who recommended first up that I read the old 30-year plan and the update, and is obviously a very experienced and talented public servant. We're very lucky to have her in this portfolio. Stuart Mosley and Eleanor Walker, who are all obviously members of the State Planning Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, all of you who are involved in the sort of the state planning system, you're experts and practitioners, all here in the room at the Hilton Hotel. Today's conference theme of change is highly relevant, and particularly as I'm representing a state Labor government elected just 3 months ago on a platform of change and planning for future generations. And my portfolios of trade and investment, housing and urban development and planning are all focused on sustainable growth of the state's economy for the benefit of South Australians and future generations. And this is all the more critical given the economic and social disruptions that have been caused by the COVID-19 pandemic over the last 2 years. And so today I wanted to touch on the key initiatives which the South Australian Government is implementing to enhance the state's economy. And the first of these relates to the planning portfolio. Planning establishes the state's strategic direction and vision, and it unlocks economic potential by reducing the red tape associated with planning approval processes. And as you know, a significant reform of the state's planning system was implemented early last year. This reform drew on a national and international best practice to design a system that promotes investment while protecting South Australians' what they value about the built environment. And this planning process delivered the new Planning and Design Code, which now applies consistent planning rules across the whole state. And we're only one of 2 states and territories across the nation which possess a singular online planning scheme. In comparison, New South Wales has 429 planning schemes, Queensland 97 and Victoria 83. And this reform process will continue through the development of regional plans for Greater Adelaide and the country areas. And the State Planning Commission will initiate these plans later in the year. To assist with the transition to the code, regulations were introduced to create a streamlined assessment pathway for proposals under the Federal Home Builder Grant Scheme. And now this pathway was transitional and it will continue until 30 September this year. And the shared vision underpinning these reforms from a collaboration between state and local government, the private sector, the South Australian community and representative bodies like the PIA, I confused you. It's resulted in contemporary planning policy through delivery of the code, increased accessibility through the e-planning portal and increased transparency of the decision-making processes. But no system is perfect, and make no mistake, I've received plenty of feedback from the community, whether it's been when I was knocking on doors during the campaign, from backbench MPs, from planners, from builders, from developers, lawyers, consultants. Everybody seems to hold passionate views about our planning system. The South Australian Government is committed to continuing this collaborative approach to the ongoing review and refinement of this new model to ensure that it remains Australia's preeminent planning system. And to assist us with this ongoing review, Planning and Land Use Services established a new governance model, and that includes the heads of a planning reference group consisting of external participants to provide strategic direction about the future planning system and policy improvements. And I'm pleased to note that the membership of this group includes PIA President Kate Hart and a range of other leading planning professionals from the local government sector and from private industry. Planning and Land Use Services is also undertaking a range of projects to support the continuous improvement to the planning system. And some of those projects include annual surveys of the e-planning system users and e-planning system enhancements program, and a review of fees and charges. And a key component of the planning reforms was a new code amendment process to ensure the timely delivery of zoning changes consistent with our state objectives. This is a further benefit of a single planning rule and policy framework, which enables the statewide amendments to the planning policy, enhancing the state's ability to resource and implement such initiatives. And the new process allows for a wider range of interested stakeholders, enabling council representatives and the private sector to contribute by preparing their own code amendments or by contributing to those led by others, such as the State Planning Commission or the Attorney General's Department, or the now Department of Trade, Industry and Planning. I think we're headed towards. I'm just in the middle of a MOG, which is a machinery of government. A number of state significant code amendments are currently underway through the Commission or the Chief Executive, including the Flooding Hazard Mapping Update Code Amendment, the Statewide Bushfire Hazards Overlay Code Amendment, and the Miscellaneous Technical Enhancements Code Amendment, which is all about facilitating improvements to an easy interpretation of the code. And to date, 11 code amendments have been approved since the new system went live in March 2021. The new system is leading the nation in this regard, with code amendments being progressed over within around 12 months. That's a significant improvement compared to the previous average time frame of 29 to 37 months for development plan amendments, as identified by the expert panel, the original expert panel, in its initial review of the planning system in 2014. The pending development of regional plans is key to the ongoing delivery of the new planning system and will continue over the remainder of 2022 and well into 2023. And regional plans are required to provide a framework for orderly growth that is ready to respond to our economic opportunities in each of the state's 7 planning regions over the 15 to 30-year horizon. These plans focus on the integration of land uses, transport infrastructure and the public realm, and can make recommendations about the application of the code. Regional plans identify sufficient land supply to support housing diversity, affordable living and employment growth, and identify, importantly, how growth will be managed in a region. Research is underway for the next generation of regional plans, and formal consultation is expected to occur in 2023. The 6 country plans will commence prior to the Greater Adelaide Plan, and priority is initially given to investigations in relation to the Upper Spencer Gulf to plan and prepare for the significant investment earmarked for years to come. And I might just say here, we had the hydrogen conference a couple of weeks ago, and there were a lot of big companies from both Germany and Japan expressing significant interest in hydrogen, and these are not small companies. These are big industrial conglomerates, and they are being driven by the big geopolitical trends which you see playing out because of war in Europe, because of climate change, and because of disruptions to the supply chain, which are very significant, which have been caused by the pandemic. So that'll be a critical planning process. As well as that, in the same part of the world, a detailed master plan for Port Pirie is in the early investigation stage. We'll progress that to community and stakeholder engagement as we begin to develop a future vision for that city. The primary purpose of that Port Pirie master plan is to address the relationship between the city's land use layout and patterns of historical lead contamination, which exist in varying levels across the city centre. Now, we're also putting extensive research into long-term planning for the future growth of Greater Adelaide. And this really does require a sound evidence base around current land supply and demand and key urban development trends. It's from this base that we can assess adequacy of the current supply to meet future demand, understand the key issues and challenges related to land supply, and most importantly, estimate the future land requirements for the next 30 years. And similar work informed the Commission's review of the environment and food protection areas in 2021. It's worth noting that since the COVID-19 pandemic began, there's been a slight increase in the share of development in greenfield and township areas, largely driven by the home builder stimulus package, but also driven by increased availability from working from home arrangements. And we have to carefully analyse whether that's just going to be a short-term pandemic-induced change, or whether it really is a beginning of a long-term trend. I suspect it's the beginning of a longer-term trend that won't have people working from home always, but will probably have people working from home for 1 to 2 days a week, or maybe 3 days a week, and attending the office on the other 2 or 3 days. And you can also you can see this playing out in the city centre at the moment, I think, just anecdotally. We know also COVID-19 and associated border closures from late March 2020 led to significant impacts on our population growth. And in 2020-2021, Australia's population growth plummeted to its lowest level in 100 years due to the fall in overseas migration. To better understand the impacts of COVID-19 on the South Australia's population, my department will commence a new set of population growth forecasts for the state and its regions following the release of the 2021 census data later this month. Another critical tool in our new planning system is our Australia First e-planning system. This allows for South Australians to lodge and track development applications online, search property zoning, find an accredited professional, review development rules, make payments, submit information and track major projects and development activity across the state. And it also allows for regular monitoring of processing timeframes, which can inform further improvements to the code and the development assessment process. The most recent average development approval time for deemed to satisfy development applications is just 2.25 days. Performance assessed development applications are approved in 12.8 days without public notification and 49.8 days with public notification, which is well within the statutory guidelines. There's also already been significant improvement in processing times for all the development application processes compared to the old system, and this is just one of 250 or so system enhancements that Plus has made since launching the new planning system. And among these, a number of updates have been made to improve the online public notification system for development applications, as well as which is a result of stakeholder feedback and input, which no doubt came from many of you in this room. The redesigned features include a streamlined public notification process that further improves usability of the system with a one-stop statewide digital resource for all the development applications on notification, increased rigour and consistent approach around public notification process, including the management of information, notifications and representations within the system, QR codes, which we're all very used to now, enabling easy public access to plans and information on notified development proposals, a uniform process for applications within the system, interacting and responding to representations, and more transparency over response timeframes. A subscription service is now provided to receive alerts on publicly notified developments and information through the Plan SA portal, to search registers for different types of developments such as land division or land use. Sally was good enough to give a briefing to some MPs this week on that, and I noted that many of them are going to avail themselves of that notification system, so I think that's a good thing. It will get used by those in representative democracy. The South Australian Government is committed to ensuring Adelaide remains Australia's most livable city. Ease of access to public transport, green open space, vibrant communities. And as Minister for Planning, I'm really excited to work with all the key industry stakeholders, such as the PIA, local government, the State Planning Commission, and others across our state to honour the government's commitment to commission a review of the Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act 2016 and the Planning and Design Code. Our election commitment provides for a review to be undertaken with the aid of an expert panel. I'm soon to finalise the formation of this expert panel and announce a review scope, but it will include a review of the Act, the Code and the planning system. The panel's review of the Code will consider how the policy settings currently address issues such as tree canopy coverage, the urban heat effect, urban infill and car parking. And as part of its delivery of the implementation review, the expert panel will engage with advocacy groups such as yours, as well as local government, the development industry and the broader community. And I'd certainly encourage you to all have your say on the panel's work. The expert panel will consist of 4 members appointed for 6 months. It will be a gender balance panel because 50% of the population deserves 50% of the representation. But it will include members with collective expertise in the following areas: statutory planning, including development assessment, planning policy, strategic planning, urban design or architecture, local government, public administration or the law, information technology systems or customer services systems. So there will be an expert panel to listen to you about a relatively new system, a system that is being enhanced both by PLUS, both by the State Planning Commission, but as well by this expert panel and this implementation review. In closing, the Malinowskis government looks forward to working with you, to having discussions with you, collaboration with you, with the planning profession and particularly with the PIA. Thanks, President Kate, for your invitation today, and I think they're going to throw a few questions at me, which is always a terrifying bit of the speech-making process. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Minister Champion, and I think you've graciously volunteered or been volunteered to take some high-level questions if we have a few moments. Is that okay, Minister?
Fine by me.
Good on you. So is there here's your chance. It's wonderful to hear ministers say close collaboration with the Planning Institute. It's always good to know that we're part of that conversation. Is there anything anyone wants to raise while we have the Minister in the room? Yep, Rolf.
A ring-in.
He's from... From Canberra.
I won't be. I'm intrigued to hear your story.
I was interested in your CV in that regard. Again, coming from Canberra.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Coming from Canberra, all states and my own territory at the moment is going through a planning review. And all the challenges you're facing in South Australia are also being faced in territories and states around Australia. Given your representation as a former federal member, I'm really curious, Minister Champion, to get your perspective on, have you got any consideration of maybe engaging federally? Because a lot of the challenges we as planners face, housing policy, energy, infrastructure investment, actually is impacted by federal government policy and investment. And the challenges we've had in Australia for the last 30 odd years is that in a federation we've done planning purely at a state level. Partly that's a political reason for that, but the reality is, unless we have that engagement federally on issues like migration numbers, taxation policy, we really struggle at a state and local government level. And I don't need to remind anyone that 87 cents in the dollar goes to the federal government. I think the states roughly get 10 cents in the dollar and poor local government gets 3 cents in the dollar. And all the services and investment actually happens at that lower level.
I think we got the idea.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question.
It's a big challenge.
I've got a really good answer for you too. Playford Council actually led for a long time. I think when Kate was working there, had a group with some Victorian councils and a couple of councils from New South Wales, and they would periodically visit us, and I was one of the backbench MPs that would to go to the sessions, and it was all about exactly that. There were these councils, mainly on the outer suburban fringe, but not exclusively, that were growing rapidly, were expected to provide a lot of land supply, but weren't getting their infrastructure share because, and you know how there's a big debate about pork barrelling in Canberra at the moment, but what that debate should really be about is the interaction between growth and infrastructure and making sure you get the right sort of infrastructure. Because we all know there was a tendency under, I don't want to be too partisan here, but there was a tendency under Conservative governments to favour road infrastructure and not public transport infrastructure. And public transport infrastructure is incredibly important to growth, but it's a whole range of things. If you look at my current state electorate and my old federal electorate, all the areas which Craig went and toured with the State Planning Commission, I'm very familiar with, because I was a federal MP for those areas and I understand the traffic issues in Gawler, but I also understand we've got a east-west traffic route issue because we've built this terrific Northern Expressway, but now you can't get onto it, particularly during school drop-off time. Try and come down Curtis Road or Dalkeith Road, you run into a whole heap of traffic. So that interaction between state, federal and local governments is an issue. I think the new Albanese government will be much better at this. When he was infrastructure minister, he was, really interested in getting things done, and we had a lot of attention in South Australia because of Mike Rann, Kevin Rudd, Anthony Albanese and Pat Conlon, and they really drove a lot of the things that have just been finished, like the electrification of the Northern Line. But that big infrastructure picture, that working together, all terrifically important.
We might have time for one more quick question, and there's a gentleman with the microphone.
Thanks. Thanks for your address, Minister. Also linked to sort of the review, could you please expand upon perhaps the urgency in getting the review done now, just in light of some of the comments perhaps made today in regards to the fact that the policy planning and design code is still new and perhaps some of the development approved still hasn't hit the ground, so to speak. So how will the review take account of perhaps development that's still emerging under the new policy?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I guess I think the review will, there's dual audiences. There's all of you who are experts, intimately involved in the system, understand it. And then I think there's the community, which kind of kitchen sinks with all of this. So they just see, if they see a 2-for-1 they don't like, or a apartment block go up that they don't like, they all blame John Rao, actually, interesting enough. And I think to give John Rao his due, I think he was probably the most significant planning minister in post-war history, probably since Playford's time. And I think a lot of the reforms he put in place were really far-reaching and sensible. But I think this expert panel will give a way of all of you putting your oar in, your 2 cents worth in, but I think it will also help as a way of the community giving a bit of feedback about what they want from the planning system and do it in an orderly way. I've said many conferences, I think we want evolution, not revolution. But make no mistake, there's a degree of concern out there, in the community, and it's about tree canopy, it's about heritage, it's about the good, retaining the really good things about Adelaide. I don't think it's necessarily an anti-growth agenda, but they do want to be able to have their say in the shape of the city. And I think Adelaide really is a unique place. There's literally nowhere else in the world which has got the parklands layout that we've got. And very few places in the world which are, hemmed in between Hills Face Zone and the sea, with these beautiful wine regions, north and south, and in the hills. So we've really got something unique here, and I think we've got to give confidence that we're going to preserve what's unique, what's good, what we love about Adelaide, while still, being able to drive growth, being able to give people houses, being able to give people a diversity of housing options. And one of the things, just generally, I'm most concerned about, and I think this is a problem right across the country, is there's a group of people out there now, and they're in the paper yesterday, people who are working hard, doing the right thing, but they live week to week. Their wages, they don't have many savings, and they need secure long-term rental. They need a rental market that gives them some security. And what we're facing now is a very tight rental market where many of them can't get, one of the key things in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a home. So we've really got to look very carefully at the challenges before us, and as policymakers and participants in the planning system, we've got to be responsive to Adelaide's needs. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Minister. And I'm getting very meaningful looks from your Chief of Staff. I think you may have another commitment to get to, but I did want to say thank you so much for sharing your time, knowledge, the agenda, and also the informality of your interaction today. On behalf of PIA in South Australia, I'm sure we all look forward to continuing that relationship. Thanks so much, Minister.